My name is Claire Morgan. I'm 36 years old, and for the first time in years, I thought I was finally coming home. Not just for a visit, not to pass through, but to start something real on the land my grandfather left me. I had a plan, a dream, a future I thought was already waiting for me the moment I turned off the highway onto the gravel road toward my ranch. But what greeted me wasn't home, it was steel. A tall, cold metal fence with thick black bars and a chain wrapped padlock on the only gate leading in. I blinked and stepped out of my truck, confused. The air was heavy with the scent of fresh cut wood and dust, and there was a brand new sign zip tied to the gate, property of Morgan Family Trust. Private access only. No trespassing. I rattled the gate. It didn't budge. My jaw clenched. My hand dropped from the lock to my pocket, but I already knew the key I carried for years wouldn't fit this one. My land. My name was still on the deed last I checked. My grandfather had left it to me in writing. He had signed it with his own shaking hand 2 weeks before he passed away in that hospice bed. He looked me in the eye and said, "This land is yours, Claire. You're the only one who gets it." I stepped back, taking in the sight of what used to be the entry path to the home I loved. But now there was nothing familiar. Just this cold, uninvited gate like I was the trespasser on my own land. And I already knew who did this. Not a stranger, not a developer, not some outside agency. My mother. It shouldn't have surprised me, but it still burned. 3 years ago, after Grandpa died, I left town for Colorado. I needed space. I had spent too long trying to prove myself to a family that never really saw me. I was the only daughter, the quiet one, the one who didn't follow the Morgan blueprint, marry a local man, stay in town, have kids, keep the family image intact. I had other plans. I got a degree in civil engineering. I worked in Denver for a while. But after Grandpa passed, something shifted in me. I wanted roots, real roots. I wanted to come back and take care of the ranch the way he would have wanted. So I saved up, paid off loans, built up a little nest egg. And when I felt strong enough, I called my mother to tell her I was ready to come home and settle on the land. She was cold but polite. Told me she was glad I was finally thinking about family again. She didn't mention anything about changes. She certainly didn't mention fencing off the ranch or putting it under some family trust with my name nowhere on it. Now here I was standing outside the gate looking in at the land that was legally mine but physically locked away. The barn was still there in the distance. The big red one Grandpa and I used to patch together every summer. I could see the top of the old windmill still spinning lazily in the breeze. It all looked just like I remembered it, and yet I couldn't take a single step forward. I turned back to the truck and grabbed the folder I had brought with me, the one with Grandpa's will, the original deed, and my ID. I wasn't about to let this slide. Not quietly. But I also knew better than to come at this head on with yelling and demands. My family thrives on silence. They twist it into righteousness. So I went straight to the county clerk's office. Spent the next 3 hours digging through property transfers, title records, and permit requests. And that's when I saw it. 2 months ago, a 12-foot wide sliver of land that used to serve as the access road to the ranch had been sold by my mother to a trust controlled by my older brother Derek. That tiny slice of dirt, barely enough to park a car on, was now listed under the name of Morgan Legacy Holdings. That's where they built the new gate. That's why I was locked out. The rest of the ranch still had my name on it. The house, the pastures, even the water rights. But I couldn't get to any of it because the only legal access had been severed strategically, quietly, and legally. It was a trap. A pretty one. And I had walked straight into it. That night, I didn't go back to the ranch. I stayed in a roadside motel outside of town. I laid awake staring at the ceiling fan spin in lazy circles. My phone buzzed once around midnight. It read, "Don't make this harder than it has to be. You chose to leave. Let it be." I stared at the message until the screen went dark. They thought they had me cornered, that I'd back down, that I'd fold the way I always had before. But something about that fence, something about seeing that gate where my grandfather's welcome sign used to be, it flipped a switch. They wanted me gone. So I decided to stay. Not just stay, fight, and not the way they'd expect. The next morning, I sat in the back booth of Dottie's Diner, the only place in town where the coffee still tasted like burnt beans and memories. I watched as the morning crowd came and went. Familiar faces glanced my way and nodded small-town courtesy. No one asked why I was back. But I saw it in their eyes. They knew something was up. The Morgans didn't air their business unless it was polished and staged. I stirred my coffee slowly, the creamer swirling like a storm. I hadn't touched my breakfast. My appetite had vanished the second I saw that fence yesterday. I was halfway through organizing my notes when the bell above the door chimed. I didn't have to look up to know who it was. My mother. Evelyn Morgan walked with the same stiff grace she always had. Perfect posture, perfect hair, perfect expressionless face. She spotted me immediately and made her way to the booth, sliding in across from me like this was a scheduled meeting. "I figured you'd be here," she said, placing her purse beside her. "I'm surprised you came alone," I replied. "Derek usually does the dirty work." A flicker of irritation passed over her face. "He's busy with the trust paperwork." I leaned back. "Right. The paperwork for the land that was supposed to be mine. It's not that simple, Claire." "No, it's actually very simple," I said, pulling out the deed and placing it gently on the table. "This says I own the ranch." Grandpa signed it. Witnessed, notarized, dated. She didn't even glance at it. "And yet, you left. For years. You abandoned the land. Derek and Nathan stayed. They put in effort. Time. It made sense to reorganize." "Reorganize," I scoffed. "Is that what you call fencing me out and selling the access road behind my back?" She folded her hands. "Claire, you were always independent. You had no interest in being part of the legacy." "You said so yourself." "I said I needed space," I shot back. "I never said I was forfeiting what Grandpa left me." She sighed, tired of the conversation already. The land was just sitting there, overgrown, unused. The trust ensures it stays within the family. It's protected now. From who? Me. She looked at me evenly. From being wasted. I sat there trying to breathe slowly to stop my hands from shaking under the table. There was no remorse in her voice, no hesitation, just the smooth logic of someone who had made a decision and justified it long before I arrived. "Let me guess," I said finally. "You want me to walk away, quietly, again." "There's a proposal," she said, and that was when I knew the meeting wasn't spontaneous. She reached into her purse and pulled out a cream-colored envelope. Slid it across the table like it was a gift. Inside was a typed agreement. If I agreed to relinquish all claims to the property, the trust would offer a gesture of goodwill, a check for $15,000. I stared at the number. 15,000. For 86 acres of working land, a house, a barn, and water rights. I laughed. A real bitter laugh that made a few people glance over. "You really think I'd take this?" I asked. "It's more than fair," she replied. "You haven't contributed anything. This way we avoid a legal mess." I shoved the envelope back toward her. "This isn't a negotiation. This is theft." Her expression didn't change. "Then you'll do what Sue is take your family to court. In this town." She had a point. The Morgans had been rooted here for generations. Our name was on buildings, on plaques. No one would take my side if this went public. They'd paint me as the selfish daughter trying to stir trouble, especially with my mother spinning the story. "I'm not going to sue," I said quietly. She seemed surprised. "Then what do you plan to do?" I smiled just a little. "You'll see." She studied me for a long moment. "Don't let your pride cost you more than it's worth, Claire. I'm not the one who should be worried about pride." She stood, adjusted her blazer, and left the diner without another word. I sat there for a long time, letting the silence settle. She thought I was bluffing. They all did. But I wasn't the same girl who used to shrink under her mother's gaze. I wasn't afraid of being the outsider anymore. I had something more dangerous now: clarity and a plan. 3 days after that diner meeting, I stood on the edge of county land staring at the fence again. From a distance, it looked harmless, clean, even tasteful in its modern black steel design. But up close, it was an insult, a line drawn not just in dirt, but in blood. My blood. The Morgan name meant legacy to this town. But to me, it had become something else. A chain. Pretty on the outside, polished in public, but built from manipulation, duty, silence, and control. My grandfather was the only one who ever saw me beyond the expectations. And now they'd cut off the only access to what he left for me. But if they thought the gate was the only way in, they hadn't been paying attention to who I'd become. That morning, I drove to the county records office with a new purpose. I wasn't there to confirm what I already knew. I was there to dig. And what I found gave me the first real jolt of hope since this mess started. See, the sliver of land my mother sold to the trust, the one the new gate sat on, was only part of the story. What she hadn't realized, or maybe didn't think I'd bother looking into, was that the tiny patch of land directly behind the fence didn't belong to the trust. Not yet. It was owned by an old man named Harvey Mason, a retired surveyor who lived just west of town. The property was barely half an acre, mostly overgrown brush and gravel. But more importantly, it connected the fence's backside to the public access road, a side path no one used anymore because it was steep and unpaved. It was a forgotten slice of land. To most people, useless. To me, it was everything. If I bought that patch, I wouldn't just have access. I'd control the only other physical route into the ranch, especially if I widened it, improved it, and built my own gate. Their fence would become a dead-end trap, and the padlock they held would be meaningless. I called Harvey the same day. He didn't answer at first. I left a message explaining who I was and why I wanted to talk. That night, he called back. "You Claire Morgan's girl?" he asked in a raspy voice. "Yes, sir. Though lately I'm not sure that name does me any favors." He laughed. "Heard some rumors. Your granddaddy was a good man. Helped me rebuild my shed when it caved in during the '98 storm. Didn't even ask for thanks." "I'd like to honor what he left me," I said. "But I need that land to do it." He paused. "You got the funds?" "Yes, sir, and you're not one of them trust fund Morgans trying to flip this county into something it ain't." "No," I said quietly. "They locked me out. I'm trying to get back in. Legally." Another long silence. "Come by tomorrow morning," he said. "We'll talk over coffee." I was there by 8. His place was small, modest, shaded by oak trees that looked like they'd been planted before the Civil War. We sat on his porch with mismatched mugs and watched squirrels chase each other across the railing. He didn't ask many questions. Mostly, he just watched me talk. I told him the truth. About the will, the betrayal, the envelope with the $15,000 insult, the gate, all of it. When I was done, he leaned back and said, "My land's worth about $8,000. I'll take 6. Cash." I blinked. "You don't want full value?" He shook his head. "Your grandfather gave more than that to this town. I'm just evening the score." The deal was done by noon. By sunset, I held the deed in my hand. That night, I drove out to the edge of the property. I stood in the overgrown grass of my new strip of land and looked toward the fence. From here, it was different. I wasn't staring at the gate anymore. I was behind it. They didn't know it yet, but I had just flipped the board, and I was holding the only key that mattered. The next morning, I parked my truck on the ragged edge of the newly purchased strip of land and stepped out with a hammer, a metal post, and a freshly painted sign I'd stenciled myself the night before. Private property. No trespassing access, controlled by owner. I planted it deep into the earth, just 10 feet behind the Morgan Trust gate. Then I waited. At first there was nothing. Just the breeze and the faint creak of metal as the padlocked gate rocked gently in the wind. But by 10 a.m., the first car rolled up. It was Derek. He pulled up in his slick black SUV, the one he always used to remind people he was important. He climbed out in designer boots, sunglasses, and a look that said he thought this was going to be easy. "Claire," he called, strolling toward the gate. "What the hell is this?" I didn't move. I stayed leaning against my truck, arms folded. "A sign. On my land." "This isn't funny," he snapped. "You can't just post stuff here. This isn't your property." "Actually," I said, pulling the deed from my back pocket, "this 0.47-acre parcel is legally mine. Bought it 3 days ago. Recorded at the county clerk's office yesterday morning. You can check." He squinted. "That's behind the fence. That doesn't get you into anything." "It gets me behind your little gate," I said. "And it controls the only usable drive-up access, unless you plan to start parachuting in." He muttered something under his breath and pulled out his phone. "I'm calling Mom." I smiled. "Tell her I said hi." 20 minutes later, Evelyn Morgan herself arrived, this time in her old white Cadillac with tinted windows and her hair done like she was headed to Sunday service. She stepped out slowly, dignified, and walked toward the gate like a queen inspecting a rebellion. "What are you doing, Claire?" she asked, her voice flat. "Taking back what's mine," I said. "This is childish." "What's childish?" I replied. "Is fencing me out of my own ranch and then trying to bribe me with 15 grand like I'm a problem to be bought off." She didn't flinch. "You bought a useless piece of dirt. It's not useless if it breaks your monopoly. We own everything around it. But not the land under your gate," I said, "and not the road leading in." Derek stepped forward. "You think this is going to scare us? You think putting up a sign makes you powerful?" I looked him dead in the eyes. "I think it makes you nervous." He stared at me for a long second, then spat on the ground. "You're gonna regret this, Claire." Evelyn said nothing more. She turned, walked back to her car, and left without another word. I watched them drive off and felt the first flicker of satisfaction settle in my chest. Not because I had won, not yet, but because they knew they weren't in control anymore. That night, I installed trail cameras. Quietly, discreetly. I didn't trust Derek or his ideas of revenge. I also upgraded the old gate behind the new one, added a fresh padlock, oiled the hinges, and even mounted a motion light nearby. By the end of the week, they had posted their own sign just in front of mine. "Warning: entry into Morgan Family Trust property without written consent will result in prosecution." I laughed when I saw it. They were bluffing. They still didn't understand. This wasn't just a fight over access. This was about power, legacy, and I wasn't backing down. A few days later, I got a letter in the mail. It wasn't official, no legal letterhead, no lawyer's name, just a typed-out note on thick paper with my mother's cursive signature at the bottom. It read, "Claire, this land has been part of the Morgan lineage for generations. You have always been a part of that even when you left. Please don't tarnish that history with pettiness. Walk away while there's still time to do so quietly." I folded it up and tucked it into my drawer alongside the envelope with the $15,000 offer. They still thought this was about noise. They didn't understand the silence I'd mastered all these years. They didn't know how dangerous it had become. The more I stared at the gate, the more it became a symbol of every conversation I'd ever had to walk away from. I didn't walk away this time. Instead, I went back to the county records office with a new mission, not to just look at my land deeds, but to trace theirs. The fence, the gate, the sliver of dirt it sat on. I wanted to know everything: how they'd pulled it off, who helped them, what paperwork they'd slid across, what desk when no one was looking. It took 3 hours, a patient clerk named Rayanne, and a $22 printing fee. And what I found? It was more than satisfying. Turned out the strip of land the Morgan Family Trust had used to install the gate wasn't acquired directly. It had been leased, not purchased, from a tiny private road maintenance LLC that my Uncle Nathan had quietly set up 6 months prior. On paper, the land still belonged to a defunct ranch company from 2 counties over, long forgotten, absorbed in a merger, but never updated in the zoning maps. Which meant their ownership wasn't real. Which meant the gate was, legally speaking, installed under temporary authority, subject to challenge. The words revocable easement jumped out at me like fireworks. In short, they didn't own the land. They were borrowing it through paperwork built on shaky legal stilts. And guess what? That LLC, the one Nathan used, it didn't properly file its annual renewal this year, which meant it was inactive, which meant I filed a petition the next day to reclaim use rights of the land as an adjacent owner. I didn't go in loud. I didn't notify them. I just handed the paperwork to Rayanne with a steady hand and a copy of my new deed. 2 days later, it was approved. I now owned the actual dirt the Morgan Trust gate stood on. I sat in my truck that evening with the title in my hands, the sunset bleeding across the windshield, and I laughed. Not a big, triumphant laugh. Just a quiet one. A tired one. Because I wasn't done yet. But I was in. Really in. That weekend, I called a locksmith named Deshaun, who owed me a favor from years ago when I helped him get out of a messy real estate flip with my financial spreadsheets. He arrived early Sunday morning, toolbox in hand. He stared at the gate and raised an eyebrow. "You serious?" "Dead serious," I said. 30 minutes later, the lock was gone and a new one was in its place, one I controlled. That afternoon, I took a walk. For the first time in almost a year, I stepped through the gate, across the dusty path, and back into the land that once felt like my entire world. The ranch was overgrown. The barn roof sagged in the corner. The fencing needed repair. But it was mine. I walked past the main house, still empty and silent, its windows watching me like eyes from an old memory. I didn't go in. Not yet. Instead, I walked until I reached the peach tree Grandpa planted when I was 10. It was still there. Bent, bruised, a little wilted, but blooming. I stood under its branches and breathed. This wasn't just revenge. It was resurrection. But as I stood there in the warm wind, I heard a car engine in the distance. It was faint, but getting louder. Tires on gravel. Then voices. I turned. 3 SUVs had pulled up to the gate on my side of the fence. I didn't have to squint to see Derek standing out front, flanked by Nathan and a woman I didn't recognize. Probably a new lawyer. Young, polished, overly confident. They didn't expect me to be here. They certainly didn't expect to see the new lock. Derek stepped forward, fuming. "What did you do?" "Fixed it," I said calmly. "You were trespassing. This gate belongs to the trust." "No," I said, holding up the deed. "This land does. And now so does the gate." Nathan barked out a laugh. "You think a piece of paper is going to stop us?" "No," I said. "But a court injunction will, which I filed yesterday." The lawyer stiffened. "You have no legal right." "I have 2, I interrupted. "Deed ownership and revocation of easement based on LLC forfeiture. Your gate's standing on borrowed time. Literally." They stared at me, stunned. It was the first time they didn't have a smug comeback. I looked each of them in the eye. "You wanted to shut me out. You wanted to erase me. But the thing you never understood is I know how to read the fine print, and I've had a lot of time to learn." I turned and walked back down the path toward the barn, leaving them standing on the wrong side of the gate, just like they'd done to me. Only now, the key was in my pocket. You'd think that would be the end of it. You'd think after I changed the lock, reclaimed access, and showed them the deed, they'd retreat, regroup, and maybe even rethink what legacy meant. But this was the Morgan family. They didn't lose. Not without trying to burn everything down first. Literally. 3 nights after I locked them out, I was in the barn brushing down Dusty, my grandfather's old mare I'd just brought back from boarding, when I heard something odd. A soft clink, then a faint metallic hiss. I froze. Dusty perked her ears. I slipped the brush back into the bin and crept toward the back door. Moonlight washed across the fields, casting long shadows. That's when I saw it, 2 silhouettes near the old hay shed, both hunched low. One held a red canister. The other was dragging something across the dry, straw-covered ground. Gasoline. I didn't stop to think. I pulled my phone from my back pocket and hit record. Then I backed into the barn, flipped the breaker to kill the lights, and snuck out the other side. There was a small ridge beside the peach tree, just high enough to see over the roofline. I crouched behind it and kept filming as one of the figures lit a match and dropped it. The flame sputtered once, twice, then a burst. The corner of the shed caught instantly. I grabbed my radio and called in the fire. Claire Morgan reporting active arson at 2138 County Line Road. Property fire in progress. The operator didn't even ask questions, just took my name and said help was en route. Then I watched as the 2 figures panicked. One dropped the can, the other tripped. They scrambled toward the fence, but this time the gate didn't open. Because I had the only key. They had to run the long way around. By the time the fire department arrived, I had the blaze mostly under control with the ranch hoses and a shovel. The structure was damaged, but the barn was untouched. No animals were harmed, and I had everything on camera. I showed the footage to the sheriff that night, Sheriff Harwood, a man who used to eat lunch with my granddad every Wednesday at Miller's Diner. He watched the whole video in silence. When it ended, he looked at me and said, "You want me to say who I think that looks like?" "No, Sheriff," I said. "I just want it filed." He nodded. "It's going to get ugly. It already is." He sent a deputy to patrol the area for the rest of the week just in case. But the worst wasn't over. Because a few days later, I found a drone hovering over my porch. It was sleek, silent, and just high enough to avoid casual detection. It wasn't a toy. It was surveillance. I didn't wave. I didn't hide. I walked inside, came back out with my granddad's old Remington, and shot it clean out of the sky. The sound echoed through the hills. A few neighbors heard it. A few called to ask if I was all right. One of them, Mrs. Langley, told me she saw a black SUV driving slowly down the access road earlier that morning. I didn't need to ask who it was. Later that night, I received an anonymous email. "We're not done. You don't belong there. The land deserves better than you. No name, no signature, just venom." I didn't reply. Instead, I printed it. I added it to the envelope I was keeping in my drawer, the one with the $15,000 check, the typed letter from my mother, and now the threats. Evidence. I wasn't planning to retaliate with violence. That's not my style. But I was planning to finish what they started, because I had something they didn't: time, truth, and the law. I called Travis Caldwell the next morning, an attorney who owed me a favor from when I helped his sister avoid foreclosure by finding an error in her escrow reports. "Claire," he said groggily, "it's Saturday. I've got a fire, a drone, a trespassing claim, and a trust with revoked access trying to frame me for public nuisance. Give me 10 minutes. He met me at the ranch that afternoon with coffee and a notepad. We reviewed everything: the deeds, the footage, the property lines, the fire damage, the threats. When we finished, he looked at me over his glasses and said, "They think you're playing defense. Let's go on offense." We filed for an emergency injunction to freeze any future development or trust activity tied to the access road, citing active endangerment, illegal surveillance, and retaliatory damage to personal property. We also filed a countersuit. Travis was smart, but I was patient. And I had one last piece to play. By the time our court date arrived, I had stopped hoping for an apology. I wasn't looking for one anymore. I wanted resolution, recognition, and maybe finally release. Travis and I walked into the courthouse side by side. He carried a slim briefcase. I had my documentation binder tucked under one arm and the silver gate key dangling from a simple leather strap around my wrist. It wasn't a show of power. It was a reminder. They locked me out. I found my way back in. The courtroom was smaller than I expected. Wood-paneled walls, dusty light filtering through thick blinds, and a judge named Marion Leeds, a woman with eyes like polished stone and a reputation for not suffering fools. On the left side of the room sat my mother, Claire Sr., her lawyer, and Derek. My uncle Nathan sat 2 rows behind them, pretending not to make eye contact. None of them acknowledged me. Fine by me. I nodded at the bailiff, took my seat beside Travis, and waited. Judge Leeds began promptly at 9:00 a.m. First came the review of the property documents. Travis laid out the timeline clearly: the original will from my grandfather, the attempted override by the Morgan Trust, the illegal gate installation, and the LLC loophole that gave me back the land underneath it. Then he showed the deed from the strip I bought, how it rerouted access and legally severed their grip. Their lawyer, a thin man named Callahan, with a smile like a paper cut, stood and tried to spin it as a family misunderstanding blown out of proportion. Judge Leeds raised an eyebrow. You're saying building a fence around someone's legal property and locking them out is a misunderstanding? Callahan stammered something about intergenerational asset protection. She waved it off. Then Travis played the drone footage, the men near the barn, the fire, the panic, the escape. And then he submitted the email. I saw my mother's face go pale when the screen lit up with those words, "You don't belong there." She knew what it meant. We all did. For the final blow, Travis stood hands steady and placed the gate key on the evidence table. This, he said, is the only key that fits the lock on the gate installed by the Morgan Trust. But the gate no longer belongs to them. The land it sits on was transferred, filed, and notarized in the name of my client. This is not just a symbol. It's proof of ownership of access and of the right to be home. He sat down without another word. Judge Leeds took a long pause. Then she leaned forward. Claire Morgan, Jr., she said, eyes locked on mine. Do you wish to maintain sole access to the property in question? Yes, Your Honor. And do you intend to continue restoring and residing on the land I do? She looked down at the key, then back at my mother. In my experience, fences are rarely about property. They're about power. This one was no exception. She ruled in my favor. All trust claims were dismissed. Ownership was reaffirmed. And the Morgan Family Trust was fined for unlawful encroachment, environmental risk due to the fire, and unauthorized surveillance. The fine wasn't huge, just enough to sting, but the real consequence was this. They lost the narrative. They lost the grip. They lost me. As we left the courthouse, Travis clapped me on the shoulder and said, "You want to ride back?" I shook my head. "I've got the key. I'll walk." It was symbolic, maybe even dramatic, but I didn't care. I wanted to feel the ground beneath my boots. I wanted the dust to cling to my jeans. I wanted to see the land the way my grandfather did, not as acreage, but as legacy. When I reached the gate, it stood exactly as it had before, tall, locked, cold. But this time I didn't rattle it. I pulled the key from my wrist, slipped it into the lock, and turned. Click! The sound was soft, but to me it was thunder. I stepped through, locked it behind me, and walked down the long dirt path to the peach tree. Dusty was grazing nearby. The barn still smelled faintly of smoke, but I'd sanded down the scorch marks, fixed the hinges, repaired the roof. I'd rebuilt my way. That night I stood on the porch of the ranch house with a mug of coffee and the key still in my hand. I didn't hang it up. I didn't put it away. I kept it with me because the fight might be over, but the history never was. But now it belonged to me. All of it. Spring came late that year. The peach blossoms didn't open until the first week of April. But when they did, they burst into color like they'd been waiting on me to finish fighting. I spent my mornings under that tree sitting on the old wooden bench Granddad built when I was 12. The same bench where he used to read mail out loud, one hand on his coffee, the other resting on my shoulder like punctuation. Now it was just me and the land, and peace. The lawsuit faded into memory, replaced by the slow rhythm of fence-mending garden planning and learning how to be alone without being lonely. A few neighbors stopped by. Quiet folks, honest. They brought jam jars and stories, never asking about the headlines or the gate. Only one person came with questions. My cousin Rachel. She parked her car 100 yards back from the house and walked the rest of the way with her palms up as if approaching a skittish horse. I met her halfway. "I'm not here to defend anyone," she said, voice soft. I wanted to see for myself." We sat under the peach tree. She didn't bring up Evelyn. She didn't mention Derek. Instead, she asked about the chickens, the roof repairs, the old cellar that used to flood every spring until I reinforced it. We talked for an hour like cousins again. And before she left, she said, "I think Granddad would have been proud. Not just because you fought back, but because you stayed." That stuck with me. Later that night, I pulled out the old envelope, the one I'd been keeping in the drawer. The $15,000 check was still there, void, now irrelevant. Beside it, the anonymous email, the unsigned letter. I added a note of my own. Just 6 words. I kept the key. Claire. Then I folded the whole stack into a manila folder, sealed it, and drove to town the next morning. I dropped it off at the county archive. Not for revenge, for record. Because if someone down the line ever wanted to know what happened to the Morgan Ranch, if they ever asked why there was only one entrance and why the matriarch no longer visited, they'd find it. The truth. Not the version dressed up in real estate brochures or whispered in garden clubs. The real one. Weeks passed. Then one day, a letter came in the mail. It was written on plain stationery. No seal, no return address, but the handwriting was unmistakable. Evelyn Morgan, my mother. It said, "The house feels quiet without you. I can't say I'm sorry for all of it, but I am sorry for some. I thought I was protecting something. Maybe I was just trying not to lose it. You built something out there. I hope it brings you peace." There was no signature, no invitation, just that strange, raw honesty. I didn't write back, but I didn't rip it up either. I slipped it into a drawer beside Granddad's old field journal and let it rest there. Some wounds don't need to be reopened. They just need to stop bleeding. That summer, I threw a small barbecue under the peach tree. Nothing fancy. Just a few folding chairs, a string of lights, and a cooler full of soda and stories. Rachel came. So did Mrs. Langley from up the road. Even Sheriff Harwood stopped by and helped flip burgers while humming Johnny Cash. At sunset, I stood at the gate and looked down the road that once locked me out. Now it was quiet. No drones, no signs, no intrusions, just gravel and grass and the faint smell of ash from a fire I'd already put out. I held the key in my hand, still attached to its worn leather loop, and for the first time I thought about hanging it up. Not to forget, but to remind that fences can be built out of wood or out of people, and the only ones that truly matter are the ones we choose to open.